Hello everyone, welcome to UGC 112, World Civilizations 2. This is Lecture 16, The World of Early Industrial Capitalism. Now, last lecture we looked at agricultural developments like the four-field crop rotation and how that revolutionized the production of food. Land was now being used more efficiently because of these developments, and there was also more land being used due to things like the Enclosure Acts. Those same Enclosure Acts drove many people off the land, land that their families had been working on for just generations. The more efficient use of land meant that there was going to be more food. And the fact that you could grow more food off of, smaller amounts of land meant that some of the land could also be used to raise sheep. After the 7 Years' War, you remember that Britain really began to emerge as the dominant economic power in the world. Demand for English wool went up, and so over time more and more land was being used for raising sheep. This demand for wool also led to a revolution in the use of machines to help speed up the long process of taking the raw wool from sheep and turning it into the finished product of cloth. Part of that revolution was the adaptation of machines like the spinning jenny, which we see on our bottom left here, to hydropower, being powered by water. The Industrial Revolution really took off once James Watt made steam power efficient enough to use for many different things, and also when he adapted his engine for textile use and the use for grinding grains. So, between the Enclosure Acts and the adaptation of steam to textiles, we see that many people could no longer make a living the way their families had for, like I said, generations upon generations. Some of these people would emigrate to the United States or the colonies or Australia. But many others would find new opportunities closer to where they were traditionally from, in growing towns and cities. And these new urban centers had factories, so they had jobs. These cities grew more and more as people came looking for those jobs in factories, and in doing so, in moving to these places, the lives of these people were drastically changed. One of the biggest changes was fundamentally who you worked for. Before the Industrial Revolution, small landowners and small shop owners worked for themselves. Even those who worked on land for others, they earned a noticeable share of the profits of that land, right? So they would work it, they'd get a good chunk of what they had done, and then they would give some of that over to the landowners. In factories, the workers really, toiled away for owners who they rarely ever saw. And for this, they never really saw more than, their meager wage either. So it's not like they had big shares in the profits. No, they just got their wages. Their lives were also changed by the sense that when they lived in the country, their schedules and everything was governed by the sun and the seasons. They worked when the sun was out, and the time of year determined what type of work, was being done. In the city, they really just worked according to the factory's hours, which were, driven home to these people by the use of bells. So, the bells and whistles would go off saying when shifts were ending or beginning. And no matter the season or time of day, the factories could continue on. I mean, these were going 24/7, basically. Well, not 24/7, they would be off Sunday, but, you know, they had the capability to be running whenever. The healthy, active life that was, living outdoors that they had known previously was replaced by spending 12 to 14 days working inside 6 days a week. Yeah, so 12 to 14-hour days, working 6 days a week. Like I said, you get Sunday off because for religious purposes, basically. The healthy diet of the country, foods that you either grew yourselves or your neighbors had grown, was replaced by whatever types of food they could get in the local shops. Often, bread was the big main staple, and the quality of bread could vary dependingly. Working, such long hours with less healthy foods, and especially, in close quarters, led to outbreaks of disease. And outbreaks of disease were also helped by the fact that the factories were often quite dirty, and they had lots of fluff floating around the air. And this could lead to, lung diseases. Or if a spark somehow hit one of these pieces of fluff, the whole place could basically go up in fire. And then that is to say nothing of the dangers of working with moving machines. Now here's what, a factory in a growing city would kind of look like. So I wish I could have actually found the scene from the miniseries North and South. That's what that was from. This clip ends right before the true power of the floor manager is shown. Right after this, the manager catches a worker trying to smoke a pipe in the factory, which is a really dumb thing to do. And for it, the manager physically beats him pretty badly. And like I said, the manager had his reasons, because smoking a pipe is a really stupid thing to do in a factory like that. Because, like I said, with a spark striking one of those little pieces of fluff, the whole thing could have gone up in flames. But that still shows just like a tremendous amount of power that you could physically beat a worker. who's working for you. It's impressive. So let's discuss a bit more about what work was like inside the 19th century factories. Like we said, 12 to 14-hour shifts were the norm, though it wasn't unheard of for people to work 16-hour shifts. And just kind of imagine spending 12 to 14-hour days standing over the same machines, doing the same work. Lots of repetition. You have minimal breaks throughout the day, and remember, this happens 6 days a week. You only get Sundays off for, the religious purposes. And think of the dangers that these machines pose to you if, let's say, your mind wanders or you grow tired from all this work and all this repetition. Now, the bathrooms in these early factories were really not much more than, holes in the ground. There was really no indoor plumbing early on, and in general, the sanitation was poor. And as we just saw in the video, the air was very, very polluted with fluff, and like I said, this could cause diseases like tuberculosis and emphysema. Factories were also very, very noisy, and here is an example of what it kind of would sound like. Now, just imagine that. This is one power loom in India. And you have to imagine the factories in the 19th century having, over 100 of these running at the same time. So you just hear that constantly going, and very, very loudly because of, there being over 100 machines of them. Now, the workforce consisted of men, women, and even children as young as 6. So we can see there's a man there, there's some men in the background there. There's a woman, some more women. And if you look, there's a child right there. Oh, there's some children there too. Little girl right there. So, yeah, basically, the entire family really needed to work in order to support the family. Here you can see some boys working the machines. One doesn't even have shoes on. Look at this. This poor kid doesn't even have shoes on, and he's working with these machines. And like I said, it wasn't just boys. Here we see a little girl in the middle of the machines, and again, she is shoeless as well. Now, why were children especially useful in these factories? I mean, obviously they're an extra set of hands, which is useful, but what made them especially useful was their size. Let's say a machine jammed up. Children were small enough to climb under and into the machines, and here we can, in fact, see there's a little girl climbing out from underneath it. This machine here. And it was not uncommon for a child to remove the thing that was jamming the machine. The machine starts to run up again because they don't really turn them off. And then, At best, maybe a finger is lost. Hopefully not a hand crushed or something like that. But it was decently common for people to lose parts of fingers from working in the factories. The size of children also made them very useful in mines, and women as well. Their smaller build. Basically, the company could cut a lot of the cost out because they could make the tunnels smaller. So you could see, women pushing a cart here, and well, there's a little boy doing it, and then look at this little boy. I think he's from like Utah or Colorado, I believe, just like smoking a pipe and ready to go work in a mine. That's insane. Now, the few people who did live into old age, but then not being able to work the machines any longer, they could sometimes be employed to sweep the floors, kind of try and keep things as tidy as they could. But really, once they were no longer useful, the workers would just be cast aside. So, like I said, the elderly, if they couldn't even find a use for them, like sweeping up and stuff, they would just be cast off. If you got injured bad enough, like let's say someone lost an arm or something and they couldn't do their job, then that person just cast aside. And that's really because at this time workers were seen not much differently than cogs in the machine. It's a little jaded to say, but it's pretty true based on their treatment and whatnot. And of course, working in the factory, this meant that people, all ages, genders, were subject to the same punishments as the floor manager. Whatever the floor manager saw fit, that was the punishments that he could lay out. And so people were subjected to all of this for, like I said, meager wages. Of course, it was better than not working at all. Better than not being able to provide for your family on the farm anymore. But we could see children under 11 being paid 2 shillings and 3 to 4 pence a week. So a 6-day week. These are the wages. And men get noticeably higher than women do, which sadly still happens today. But this is absurd. Over 2 times in many cases. And just to give you an idea, I said shillings and pences. To have a loaf of bread a day, for a week would cost about 1 shilling or so. And just for one male worker in Manchester to feed himself, just himself, on bread would be 15% of his salary. And, obviously the women earning much less, that would be a lot harder for them to support. So really, you needed your family members to all kind of contribute, because, the men made an okay wage, and everybody else really did not. Okay, so that's kind of depressing enough looking inside these factories. But so let's imagine that we've just finished our 14-hour shift. Oh, the repetition was terrible. We're all tired now. So let's leave the factory. Here's what the skyline would look like. This is Manchester here. You can see the many smokestacks, just churning out the smoke. And walking along the streets, you have these very, very cramped and crowded houses. People outside getting the little bit of sunlight that they can. Not that you see much sun with that much smoke. It's not really going to take us long to return home, because usually the building that everyone stays in, or many people stay in, is pretty close to the factory. And This is a building where the entire family shares a single room. Oftentimes these buildings were owned by the factory owners themselves, so, they charge you rent. So you're just kind of paying them back their money that they just paid you. And like I said, very early on, very few families could afford to own their own house. So often they would lease out rooms in like apartment buildings or tenant houses, that type of stuff. This is a family actually in New York City that was all living in one room. The only bathroom for these buildings was a shared outhouse in the yard, and this was only emptied if the building paid someone to come and empty it. So you'd have to collect some money from everybody and pay so that they would empty your outhouse for you. You can just imagine the smell of an outhouse, and then you mix that in with all the smoke and everything. Not the greatest, most clean area. And these were the living conditions for most people. But really, due to working such long hours, with the repetition and the hard work, in your free time, basically what you did was you ate and you slept before going to work again. You just worked 14 hours. You have to go back, not, in 10 hours. So, a lot of people are just so exhausted that really your home life is just getting a meal in and sleeping. As you can see in this picture where everyone's asleep except for the poor woman who's looking after this exhausted child. So like I said, this is much different than what they had lived before. And these were the changes that were really felt by the people in the lower class, right? This change in lifestyle. But industrialization also had larger social impacts, much like we saw at the beginning of the semester. You'll recall that, in the Renaissance lecture, we talked about how in the Middle Ages, the nobility were the very powerful and the landowners, and because they owned that land, that was where their power came from. But as we shift out of the Middle Ages into the beginning of the Renaissance, we saw the development of a merchant class who grew in wealth and then power due to trade. In England, these members of the merchant classes began to enter into the House of Commons in Parliament, and some even could make it into the House of Lords. But no matter which body of Parliament they joined, they became a part of the government, and especially the House of Commons was an integral one once they took control of the royal purse. Remember Charles trying to fight with Parliament because he didn't have control of the money? So those people are from this merchant class. And we're going to see a similar phenomenon during the Industrial Revolution. There was a rise in wealth and power of a new class, and this class was made up of people we call industrialists. Now, industrialists were the owners or investors in factories and in the new industrial technologies that were being developed. And like the merchants, their wealth led them to becoming members of the House of Commons, and also similarly, some of the big industrialists would make it into the House of Lords. They would gain some titles as well. This picture here that we see are actually of American industrialists. Vanderbilt is one of them there. But, it's the same kind of idea, right? Where you have the workers supporting these industrialists. The workers are doing all the work, and the industrialists are the ones who are really gaining the main profits from it. Now, with many industrialists entering both houses of parliament, who do you think they cared for more? Themselves or the workers whose labor they've already been profiting from? Not surprisingly, it's themselves. In 1799 and 1800, both those years, they passed two different laws called Combination Acts. And what these did was these forbade the formation of unions and thus collective bargaining. So because of these two acts, people couldn't form unions. Now, unions are, kind of a hotly debated topic in the modern world. And, I don't really try not to put your idea of what a modern union is when we're talking about these ones, because really, you can say modern unions are, so corrupt and everything, and they definitely have their weaknesses, but I can guarantee you that without the ability to form unions and then to thus collectively bargain, working conditions would not be what they are today. I mean, I can guarantee you that they would not be. So, while there were many industrialists, and of course their allies in Parliament, there were also people called liberals. And again, as with the term union, let's try to not think about, any modern notions that we have with liberals. I'm sure, you've heard of many people, using it as a derogatory term. Maybe you yourself have used it as a derogatory term. But these are different liberals than, whatever modern sense people are trying to convey when they use liberals in that way. These liberals, really, their goals were to investigate working conditions and then to make changes legally. These are going to be legal changes that were going to try to help out the workers. These were the people kind of looking out for those who were doing so much and getting a lot less than the people who were, watching over them. A pivotal event happened in 1819 in the city of Manchester. We mentioned a couple times. Manchester is really one of the major, if not the major, industrial cities in England during the Industrial Revolution. It's up in the kind of northwest of England. And more specifically, it occurred at St. Peter's Field in Manchester. On August 16th, 1819, a crowd of around 60 to 80,000 people gathered, and basically they were demanding voting rights that were more fair to them. At the time, voting was restricted to males who own land with a rental value of 40 shillings or more for a year. So, they had to own land, and if they were going to rent it, they could get 40 shillings a year, which is about 80 pounds in 2008. So it's not like a crazy amount of money, but, you got to remember, most of these people can't even afford, they've lost all their land out in the country. They can't afford houses. They can't afford land, especially in these growing cities as prices are going up, as more people are going in. Some industrialists are buying areas to build more tenant houses and stuff like that. And then to make voting even more restrictive, votes could only be cast in the town of Lancaster, which is roughly 55 miles away from Manchester. And that was true for all the area. It wasn't just Manchester that had to vote in Lancaster, but all the area had to vote, had to go to Lancaster and vote. And like I said, from Manchester, it's about 55 miles away. So, like I said, obviously most workers didn't even meet the land condition, but the few who might, they could have a really tough time going 55 miles to vote. So, they felt, the workers made a large component of the people in Manchester in general, just the population. The population was a lot of workers. And in this demonstration, a lot of the 60 to 80,000 people were definitely workers as well, because they felt like they were not being represented by Parliament, by their government. To make matters worse, England was kind of feeling the effects economically of fighting the Napoleonic Wars. They just defeated Napoleon in 1815, as you remember. And I don't know, it kind of hit the whole country kind of hit this economic, lag. And what the industrialists did was they cut the wages of the workers. So the men who, used to earn 15 shillings a 6-day week in 1803, by 1818, that was cut down to 5 shillings. So they're making 33% of what they had normally made in a week. And like I said, remember, to feed just one person, that male, if let's say he didn't have a family, it cost 1 shilling to have a loaf of bread every day for a week. So now, what was once 15 to 20% of his income is a fifth. So, I guess that's still 20, but, it's a big deal having less money, obviously. So, with these people meeting on this field, the local magistrates decide the best way to stop this is they would call in the military to arrest the organizers of the event. They do that. The military comes in, and the commander orders the cavalry to charge upon the crowd with their sabers drawn in order to arrest these organizers. I don't know how this possibly seems like a good idea, but in the chaos of it all, 15 people would be killed or, would die from their injuries. And another 400 to 700 were injured. Because of the nature of, this cavalry coming in and attacking people, the event got this kind of ironic name, Peterloo, which is a play on Waterloo, because Waterloo, the final defeat of, when the British and the rest of Europe defeated Napoleon in 1815, had a famous cavalry charge in it. So this massacre got the, kind of ironic name Peterloo for that. And in fact, one of the men who died from his wounds in this demonstration, in this massacre, a man named John Less, he was a factory worker in Manchester, and he had actually fought at Waterloo. And, like I said, he died in September, so it took a while. He was in a hospital for a while trying to recover. But before his death, he said that Peterloo was much more dangerous than Waterloo. Because, quote, "At Waterloo there was man to man, but this was downright murder," end quote. So you kind of get the sense that there was this man who fought in this very, very famous battle, and he says that, the it was much more dangerous for him to be in this massacre because, these people were unarmed. These are just people protesting and gathering, and, they're attacked by their own government and their own soldiers with swords. Perhaps not surprisingly, the Peterloo Massacre really began to turn public opinion towards the side of the workers and, the liberals who were working for the workers. And here, in fact, you can see a George Cruikshank caricature mocking those responsible for the massacre. And we can see the commander here telling his, rather well-fed troops, especially compared to the poor people being slaughtered. You can see how they're very well-fed, look rather buffoonish. But he's telling them, "Down with them! Chop them down, my brave boys! Give them no quarter! They want to take our beef and pudding from us! And remember, the more you kill, the less poor rates you'll pay, or you'll have to pay, so go at it, lads! Show your courage and loyalty." So, not, in this caricature, you hear the very, very common idea when that the improvement of some other person, it somehow takes away from yours. And, if you read anything today, oftentimes people are seen like, if you're trying to fight for anyone's improvement, then you're trying to take something away from them, which is not true. But, like I said, they want to take our beef and pudding from us. That's ridiculous. They just want to be able to live. And then remember that the more you kill, the less poor rates you'll have to pay. A poor rate was basically a small tax that people who owned land would pay so that poor people, so there were like places where poor people could eat or get cheaper food and some warmth if they needed it. Yeah, it's a pretty scathing commentary by George Cruikshank. Now, using the momentum from this turn in public opinion, the Combination Acts were repealed pretty shortly after in 1824. So, just within 5 years, the Combination Acts were repealed. It was still very, very difficult to form unions at this time. Workers were often scared because owners could fire them. On a basic level, you could be fired, if they found out that you were starting to try and form a union. And then worse, if a worker was fired, they could also be kicked out of their housing, if the factory owner also owned the building that they lived in. And furthermore, that worker might be blacklisted by the owner. And what this means is, basically the owner would tell all the other factory owners in the area, or, even further, not to hire this worker. He's a troublemaker or whatever. And then the person who just lost their job can't find another job because none of the factories will hire them because of what this factory owner said. And again, you can imagine, you have a family, maybe your whole family gets fired and blacklisted. So the factory owners have ways to make people at least not want to join unions or scared to join unions. And there were still other ones, just intimidation as well. Still, unions were formed over time, despite, fear and other difficulties. And, here we see a group of women and some men that have joined together in 1888 there. So, further changes occurred in part due to the use of a new tool for liberals. And this tool was blue books. Yes, the mean, unfair, and tyrannical liberals forced, the poor, defenseless industrialists to write essays where the industrialists had to pretend that they were some figure in history and, lay out what they would do or something like that. And even worse, those mean, unfair, tyrannical liberals again, they would have the poor unfortunate victims, choose the topics randomly. Wait, that doesn't sound right. Oh no, those are the blue books I use. No, I mean, these blue books, these were governmental reports, that got their nickname due to the blue covers on them. And the reports, besides, containing detailed descriptions of what was happening, they also had drawings made by artists who were sent to the site. They were sent along there with the investigators so that they could draw what they saw, draw the conditions. In 1833, a Factory Act was passed, and it was concerned with child labor. Some of the conditions that it set out was that children under 9 couldn't work in textile mills. Children under 18 couldn't work at night, so that's kind of nice there, right? Children 9 to 13 couldn't work more than 8 hours, and they had to get an hour lunch. And then they also had to go to school for 2 hours a day, which was paid for by taking it out of their pay. So, had to go to school, but they had to pay for it directly. But it was like a pence or something like that, so it's still a pretty hefty thing when they don't get paid that much. For children 14 to 18, they couldn't work more than 12 hours, and they got an hour lunch now. So, still very, very different than what we would consider, proper child labor laws today, right? Now if you're under 18, there are hard limits, and they're not 8 hours a day. But this was a different time. This is progress, right? And more factories would pass over time. Unfortunately, some of these acts would actually raise the amount of hours that children could work again, and then it would be lowered by other ones. But overall, there was a general progress to all workers, in fact, over time. The different factory acts in general had an upward trend for the betterment of workers, and not just children, not just women, all workers. Now, due to the report that you see to the right here, there was also a Mines Act in 1842 passed, and you can see right here, there's 1842 on this book. There's our detailed drawings of poor men and women being forced to work, and there were obviously pictures of children working in mines as well, because this is specifically talking most about the children employed there. So due to this report that you see, like I said, 1842, there was a Mines Act, and what it said was that no female could work underground at all. So no matter her age, no female could work underground. And it also set out that no boys under 10 years old could work underground. As soon as you hit that double digits in age, get back underground, right? But again, this is improvement. So as the industrial age continued on, workers continued to fight for better treatment in all the industrial countries. And eventually, we arrive with the regulations that we have in place today. It took a lot longer for some people than others, than some groups than others. That's an unfortunate trend in this. But, we're still lucky because not everywhere has such regulations. And honestly, hopefully, these regulations will stay, if not get improved, but I wouldn't expect any improvements on regulations coming soon, and hopefully we can hold on to the ones that we have, because by no means do we have a perfect system for workers, but it's a lot better than what it was in the 19th century, in the 20th century, and it's because of the risks that these people took, and others among them. So we'll end here today, and on our next lecture, we're going to kind of see a new, I don't know, emotional revolution. It's going to be another different type of revolution. It's going to be one that's going to be highly influenced by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who we saw in the Enlightenment lecture, as well as industrialization. So we'll look at that next time. This is Greg, signing out.